So I've just installed Live 11 on my new rig, and I thought this would be a good opportunity to show you guys how I like to set up my preferences and walk you through some of the more important ones. If you just got Ableton and you're looking to set everything up and get it working smoothly, this might be helpful. Or if you're a more experienced user, you might be able to pick up a few tricks in this as well. Let's get started. You can open up your preferences simply by hitting Control, or Command, on a Mac. That'll bring up this little window, and you can see now we have a few different tabs that we can go through here. So we start off on the audio tab. This is where you're going to pick your audio interface if you're using one. If you're on PC, you want to select Audio, and then select your audio interface from the list down here. If you're using a Mac, this will be Core Audio instead of Audio, and you'll select your preferred output device. You can then go in and adjust your outputs, enable and disable different outputs and inputs. Sometimes I go through and name those when I'm particularly bored. And then as far as sample rate, 48K is pretty typical. Sometimes you might go down to 44.1. Sometimes you might go up to 88 or 96. 48K is fine for the majority of things. It's a whole different discussion. But in general, unless you have a specific need to go to a higher or lower sample rate, typically just use either 48K or 44.1. I like to leave the sample rate and pitch conversion on high quality because we love quality here at the Rave Barn. And then below that, you will see this little latency section. So here we have this guy called driver error compensation. So what I see a lot of new people do is start playing with this to try and get it as close to 0 as possible. That's not really what that's for. That doesn't actually affect your latency. What it does is correct for errors when your driver is reporting an incorrect latency. So pretty much you want to leave that at 0 unless you really know what you're doing or know specifically that you have a driver error problem. So if you actually want to reduce your latency, what you can do is click the hardware setup button here and a little window will pop up. This will change depending on what audio interface you're actually using. If you're using an RME, it'll look like this, but you might be using a Focusrite or something else completely different. But somewhere within your settings, you're going to have a setting called buffer size, and that directly affects your latency. Basically, the lower the buffer size, the lower the latency, but also the higher the CPU usage. So typically, you want to have this as low as you can get away with without getting clicks and crackles and pops, which will happen if it's too low, unless latency is not a concern, and then you can just crank it up. So typically I will produce and record at either 64 or 128 samples, which is very fast. And when I'm mixing and using a lot more heavy plugins, I'll switch it back to 1024. Just remember, lower equals more CPU usage and higher equals less CPU usage, so it may need to change around depending on what you're doing. If you run into any clicks or pops in your audio, it's usually because your buffer size is too small. So now let's jump up here to the Look and Feel tab. This is where you can customize the overall look and input response of Ableton. Just remember, these are all preferences, okay? They're preferences, so set this up however you like. This is just the way that I personally prefer to set it up. Now, so for the follow behavior, I typically leave this at default because I don't really use follow very often anyway. The hide labels button will give you a little bit more screen space at the sake of hiding these labels. I typically just leave it on. So sleep mode will be on by default. Or no, that's not true. Actually, this is all default. It's a good idea to keep that off. On PC, you have this nifty little option called allow multiple instances. I typically like to turn this on so I can start working on a new project when I'm exporting another one. I could be wrong, but I believe this is not available on Mac. If it is, congratulations.
Yay!
So permanent scrub areas affects the way that the audio scrubs. I just leave that on default. And then pen and tablet mode. If you're using a tablet, it can help the interface usability a little bit if you turn this on. Now, track colors and clips. I usually leave this at default. They do have this nifty little reduced automatic colors button, which kind of changes the color palette a little bit. Sometimes I'll turn it on just to make it look a little bit different. Now, you could turn on auto assign track colors, but I like a nice colorful session. Now, within the display customization, this is where it gets a little fun. You can click this theme button and you can flip through different sort of looks. And again, these are all preferences, so choose any theme you like as long as it's dark or mid-dark. If you choose light, you're a psychopath and you're going to burn your retinas. You can also zoom the display in and out if you've got a particularly large or small screen. You kind of compensate for that. And you can change the overall brightness as well. I like to maybe bump it down just a touch, just a teensy bit. And then if you're really bored, you can play with the color intensity and hue of overall everything. I've never gotten it to really look that good, so I just leave it at 0. You can also change your grid line intensity here. I typically leave that at default. Sometimes I'll bump it down just a little bit. Now we jump to the link tempo MIDI page. This is where you would set up your MIDI I/O. So if you have any controllers or anything, you can set them up here. I usually don't use link or tempo follower, so we'll just breeze on past that. By default, out of the box, Ableton recognized my complete control, which is very nifty, but it didn't recognize my SSL UF8, so I'm going to set that up real quick right now. So we set this up to Mackie control and set the input to, in my case, port 5, because I'm using this on my second layer of my SSL UF8, which is a lovely controller, by the way. And that's done. The fader's just lit up on my controller. The only other thing you might need to change in here is if you have a controller that has knobs and they're not working, you can't map them to things, you're having trouble with that, make sure that remote is turned on for that particular controller. That usually fixes the issue. Otherwise, it's usually fine to leave this as is unless you have specific MIDI changes or controllers that you need to play with. Now, under the File Folder tab, this is where you can set up a couple of things. You can change the cache and you can change the temporary folder. I just leave those at the default locations. If you have limited hard drive space, you might want to put those on an external drive or a second drive within your computer. But a fun little bit is the sample editor. So if you have any sort of a sample editing program, you can set that up here and then you can access it directly inside Ableton. So you just hit browse and then you have to navigate to your particular software. So in my case, I am using RX7 by Isotope, which is a little outdated at the moment, I guess, as my sample editor if I need to denoise something or get into spectral repair or something like that. So whatever you end up using, just navigate to the actual application folder in your programs directory and select that. So we're just going to skip the library tab altogether because I usually just leave this at default. So if you have limited hard drive space on your main drive and you use an external drive to store your libraries or your packs with the instruments that come from Ableton, you can change those locations here. I usually just leave them at default because I've got plenty of room on my system drive for that. Moving on to the plugins window. Now, by default, you will have to select your VST2 plugin folder if you're using any VST2s. I've already actually done it in this case because it typically takes a long time to scan, but what you would do is you hit browse and navigate to your VST2 plugin folder. Usually this is either C/program files /VST plugins or C/program files /Steinberg /VST plugins. On a Mac, I actually don't know. I've set this up about 500 times on PC and like twice on a Mac. And then I will enable using VST plugin system folder. If you have a custom folder, you can set that up as well. It'll take a minute to chooch, so just let it do its thing, and eventually all your plugins will be available. Now, in the plugin windows section down here, I do make a couple changes. And again, these are preferences, so this might not be a workflow that works for you, but I like to change these a little bit. I do like to keep multiple plugin windows on, but I like to turn off auto hide plugin windows and auto open plugin windows. And the reason I turn off hide is usually I'll bring up something like a meter or a limiter and I'll have that up on my second monitor all the time. And I don't want it to disappear as I click through other tracks. But I also turn off auto open plugin windows because I might drop in a rack that has like 20 plugins on it. And if you've ever done that, you know that it'll just fill up your entire screen in like 3 seconds. So typically I just turn that off and, it's not too hard to just open up the one if I need to open up a specific plugin window. Now for the big one, record, warp, launch. I don't change a ton of stuff in here, but I do change some specific stuff that I feel like is very important. And this page can affect you probably the most as far as quality and what's actually happening to the audio. So for starters, you can change your file type if you want to use AIF. WAV is super duper standard, so I would leave it at WAV. Bit depth, 24 is usually fine. If you're a psychopath and you like to fill up your hard drives, then you can switch it to 32. I don't recommend dropping it down to 16-bit unless you are really running out of hard drive space. So exclusive ARM and solo. I used to turn off exclusive solo, but everything started to get kind of glonky when I had to make a monitor bus for SonarWorks and use a Max for Live plugin that enables solo safe, since solo safe doesn't exist natively within Ableton. So for now, I leave this on but some people like to have it turned off. Exclusive arm, you probably want to keep on unless you are recording a lot of multi-source stuff like drums with a bunch of mics, or maybe you've got several guitar mics, or recording a whole band at the same time. You might want to turn that off just to make it easier to arm and disarm tracks in large quantities. Record session automation and armed tracks, I'm not really messing with session view too much these days. Now for the really important bits of warping and fades. So personally, I have a lot of stems get sent to me that I have to import into Ableton, or you might be collaborating with people a lot or working with remix stems. And one issue you may run into is that by default, Ableton will always try and warp any samples that you drop into the DAW. This can get really messy when you're importing stems. They end up not warping to the same tempo, and it changes the start times, and it's all over the place. No bueno. So I will turn auto warp long samples off, and that way when I import stems, it doesn't affect them. It doesn't try and warp them. They just drop in as just regular audio files, and then I can set the tempo manually. I'm going to make a quick video on how you can do that really quickly. Subscribe! In my workflow, leaving looping and warping short samples to auto has worked pretty fine. It's got a pretty good idea of what's a one-shot and what is a loop. The next thing that comes up is your default warp mode. This is also super important. By default, it's beats, which works really well on drums, especially when you're speeding them up. It's okay when you're slowing them down. But anything else, if you're doing any time stretching or any warping at all, the beats warp mode will cause the classic warping artifacts. So what we're going to do is we're going to change this from beats to complex. Complex works really well for the majority of sounds, and if I need to use beats, I will specifically tell that clip to use beats. Otherwise, complex is good as a default. And now for what I think is probably the most important setting in all of the preferences, this little guy right here, create fades on clip edges. You're going to want to turn that off. And here's why. Have you ever heard a kick in your library and then dropped it into Ableton and all of a sudden it sounded mushy and like crap? That's because Ableton was creating a fade on the clip edge. Automatic fades will murder your transients. Once again, all of these are preferences. However, I'm going to take a wild swing and guess that your listeners would prefer to hear your drums slap. I highly recommend that you turn create fades on clip edges off. Now, the launch mode. I only change one of these in here, and that is default launch quantization. I will typically make that a quarter note. So if you're a DJ, perhaps, you might want to keep this on a bar, or if you're doing really long format stuff with triggers way in advance, you might want to do 8 bars. But in general, for production, I like to keep it at a quarter note. You could even turn it all the way down to none, and it'll behave like literally every other DAW on the planet. But having the time sync is kind of nice when you're jumping around a project, and you can keep it going without the music stopping. I select a quarter note. The last one, and this preference is, of course, super subjective, and that is start playback with tap tempo. I personally like to turn this off so I can sit there and tap and really make sure that I'm locking in a tempo, because it takes me a minute to get my brain working with my fingy. But it can be good if you're doing like DJ sets or using Ableton in a live performance. These preferences are heavily weighed towards a production environment with 0 live usage. And that's it. Hopefully this was helpful. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments and I'll do my best to answer them. If you found value in this video, I would appreciate it if you would subscribe and drop a like, and I will see you in the next one.